conclusion of medical school and the transition into graduate medical education or residency. And I point that out because there are some significant aspects of the vision that correlate to those three periods of transition. Medical education, for the most part, in this country is still done using the Flexnerian model. Abraham Flexner, in 1910, looked at all of the medical schools in the U.S. He was paid for by the Carnegie Foundation. And I know Sam Houston State University has received some funds from the very same Carnegie Foundation. What Flexner did was look at all the medical schools and compare them to one, to Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins had the model of 2 years of didactic training and 2 years of clinical training. That model still persists today in many schools. Hopkins was founded in 1863. They patterned it after the German model of medical education. Fast forward 100 years later, the same Carnegie Foundation funded this report. It's the follow-up to the Flexner report. What they said that really, I think, summarizes their approach is the focus on professional identity formation. It doesn't matter whether it's an MD school or a DO school. The chief function of that medical school is professional identity formation. How is osteopathic medical education different from other pedagogies? Well, look at the first thing, the length of training. You can be a CPA in what? 4 years? How long does it take to be a physician? 4 years undergrad, 4 years of medical school, and a minimum of 3 years of residency. That length of training is indeed significant. And time is money. Time is money because it translates into debt, a significant student burden of debt. It's not uncommon for medical students to have, at the time of graduation, as they enter a residency, $300,000 or more of debt. And that is a national phenomenon. The teaching and learning is different. Remember I said the Flexnerian model consists of 2 years of didactic training and 2 years of clinical training or experiential learning? How do you assess that? That's different as well. There are competencies that really came out of graduate medical education. Those are things like medical knowledge, patient care, practice-based learning and improvement, professionalism, system-based care, and for the osteopathic world, osteopathic principles and practices. From there, it has evolved to EPAs. That is an abbreviation that stands for Entrustable Professional Activities. Entrustable professional activities mean things that medical students can do without supervision. A prime example is doing a history and physical. That is an EPA. There are approximately about 13 of them. And in the little corner there is the image of a publication that came out in April. It's about osteopathic version of entrustable professional activities. In other words, there is already a blueprint there, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The next item there is milestones. It sounds like pediatrics. They talk about developmental milestones. But these are the next step in the assessment process. The evolution was from competencies to EPAs to milestones. Milestones occur in graduate medical education. There's something known as Milestone 1, and that is the list of attributes, skills, and abilities and attitudes that an incoming first-year resident should have. And remember what I said about periods of transition? When that student graduates and enters a residency, that now resident as a PGY1 should achieve Milestone 1 for the specific specialty in which he or she is doing his or her residency. And then there's boards. For the LCME or MD students, it's USMLE. For the DO students, it's COMLEX. Those board exams, especially COMLEX Level 1, will define if, 1, the student can become a physician, and 2, what kind. Those board scores are misused and abused. So if you start medical school thinking, oh, I want to be an ophthalmologist, and you do not have exceedingly high board scores, you will not become an ophthalmologist. Because the residency program directors will use those scores to determine whom they invite for interviews. It's one of my favorite quotes from the philosopher Eric Hoffer. In a time of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. We are in a time of drastic change. So I'd bet my avatar on this one. Let's look at 21st century osteopathic medical education. I believe in not reinventing the wheel. In 2013, the AOA and the AACOM impaneled this Blue Ribbon Commission to look at osteopathic medical education in the 21st century. What they did was they focused on the person. And what did they come up with? I want to point out a few things, and they seem to be recurrent themes or common themes that are woven throughout. For example, leadership, interprofessional, healthcare team, data management, principles of population health, leadership, team building, working with a variety of different health professionals, professionalism, adherence to ethics, problem solving and critical thinking. To me, that means learning to think like a physician, thinking like a doctor. Capacity for self-assessment and critical appraisal. When I read that for the first time, I immediately thought of emotional intelligence. It's that kind of awareness, self-awareness, that comes out of emotional intelligence. At the same time in 2013 that this Blue Ribbon Commission was focusing on the person, the AMA had 11 grants that they distributed to 11 different medical schools looking at the process. Each one of these 11 grants was worth $1 million. And what were they looking at? Creating the medical school of the future. They were looking at the process. So you have one document that looks at the person. You have another ongoing program or project that looks at the process. So combined, you have the ability to look at both the person and the process. COMLEX Level 1 and Level 2 are the exams that the students need to take in order to graduate from a DO school. COMLEX Level 1 is typically taken at the end of the second year. That is what is really misused the most. Because in the past, if a student was able to pass COMLEX Level 1 at the first attempt, he or she was very likely to be invited for an interview for a residency. Now, it's worse, much worse. A student may pass, but unless he or she is at or above the national mean, that student will not be invited for an interview. Why is that? There are so many graduates and so few residency spots that there is increased competition. In addition to the COMLEX Level 1, there's COMLEX Level 2, which comes in two forms. So there's the written exam called the CE, usually taken during the third year, and then there's the PE, which is an exam that is a performance exam. It involves going to two different locations in the U.S., either in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, or Chicago, Illinois, and going through standardized patients, 12 standardized patients. Those videos of those students are then reviewed. And it's pass or not pass. It's a dichotomous outcome. That's not bad enough. COMLEX is changing. It's changing from a way of looking at a diagnosis to a presentation. A presentation is a patient presents to the emergency department. You describe the age, the sex, and what the patient is complaining about. History of, chief complaint. That is the presentation. So, for example, instead of saying the patient presented with an ectopic, they'll describe a patient who presents with right lower quadrant pain. And it gets even more interesting because there is this migration, this evolution to a single accreditation system for graduate medical education. Currently, there's the AOA, approval for the osteopathic residencies, and the ACGME for the MD residencies. By 2020, there will be one accreditation system, and that will be ACGMEs. So, look at that. Medical education has been and always will be stressful. In fact, I would suggest that it's become more stressful. And at the same time, our learners seem to be less equipped to handle that stress. That's why resilience is a very, very hot topic in medical education. If you look, I don't know how well you can read it, but on the left-hand side where it says the journey within, one of the things mentioned there is awareness, self-awareness. And that goes back to emotional intelligence. So there is a link between emotional intelligence and resilience. This is one of my favorite quotes of Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln said, "The best way I know to predict the future is to create it." So how would that future look if I were to create it? Let me predict it for you. What's going to be important? Apart from predicting that there's going to be uncertainty, ambiguity, and change, there's going to be an increased focus on resilience. There's going to be an increased focus on COMLEX Level 1 pass rates, on the core clerkships that comprise the third year of medical school, and there's going to be an increased focus on graduate medical education success. If you ask a medical student what's really important to you, those medical students will point out two things. The COMLEX first-time pass rates, especially Level 1, and the ability to get a residency. If you ask COCA, the organization that accredits College of Osteopathic Medicine, what do they focus on? They focus on the same two things. Imagine that. Imagine that. So, how are you going to accomplish everything? How are you going to achieve success? Of course, it involves a plan. It has to be strategic, and it has to include innovation. One of the things that I focus on is pre-matriculation. That means those students who have received that letter of acceptance, but who have not yet started the first day of classes. What would I do with that pre-matriculation? Not too far from here, there's Dr. John Pelley, PhD, biochemist at Texas Tech, who spent the last 20 to 30 years looking at medical student learning. And he has a learning style type indicator that is the Myers-Briggs. And what I have found over the years is that what matters is whether you're a sensing type or intuitive type. Those board exams are written for the intuitive type. The sensing type struggles during the first 2 years of medical school. But then once they make it to the third and fourth years, they just do wonderfully well. In contradistinction to that, the intuitive types sail through the first 2 years of medical school and then struggle in the third and fourth years. If you have a student who's a sensing type and a student who's the intuitive type, and you take both of them into a planetarium and you say, look up there, the sensing type is going to go, we're 5 stars. The intuitive type is going to look at it and just go, that's a dramina. They are hardwired to see the patterns. They don't even have to think about it. It's automatic. And I can tell you these board questions are like that planetarium. There's a lot of extraneous information in there. You have to be able to read through, sort out what's important, what's clinically relevant, and what's not, and then answer the questions correctly. And the questions are difficult because it's not recall and regurgitate. They are higher order questions. You've already heard me talk about emotional intelligence. I think it's important during that pre-matriculation to get some sort of baseline measurement of every student's EQ using a variety of validated instruments. Because it's important for that student to know that he or she may not have the kind of self-awareness that's necessary to succeed. In Philadelphia, there is a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania in the field of positive psychology. Her name is Angela Lee Duckworth. She has done a lot of work around grit. It's more than resilience. Look at it. It's perseverance and passion for long-term goals. Remember what I said about the duration of medical education? I can't think of a better example of grit than medical education. If you have a student with a low grit score, you think, is this student going to survive? Is this student going to survive without some sort of help to have more resilience and certainly more grit? If I have a student about whom I'm really concerned in my office, the home of the difficult conversation, I will say, here, fill this 12-item grit score out, and let's see where you are. You say, oh, that's good, that's reassuring. You're not as bad as I thought you were, Ken. And Gallup Strength Finder. I think we have been making a mistake in medical education. We have not been playing to students' strengths. We've been focusing on what? Weaknesses, deficiencies. We instead should be focusing on their strengths. And here are my top 5 according to Gallup Strength Finder. What's up there? Number 1 is achiever. I think that's important. When I look back at my career, I can see elements of each one of these 5 top strengths in my CV. There are a lot of students out there with depression and anxiety. They may start medical school depressed. And if they do, they are only going to become more and more depressed. As the stress increases, you're going to see more depression, more anxiety, and more of any pre-existing mental health. So I think it's important to have an idea up front if anybody has any sort of issue so it can be addressed and you can help that student succeed along the way. The next thing up there is IRB training. I think every medical student should have an opportunity to participate in research. There are very practical reasons for that. Number 1 is if they already have the IRB training, the day 1, if Chad over here has a great research project, the students say, I'm ready. Can I participate? That translates in the ability to, when you apply for a residency on something that's known as an ARIS application, to check off that box that says, yes, I've had research experience. But more than that, in terms of lifelong learning, what does it do? The farther you go in medical education, the less structured it becomes. It becomes much more a matter of self-directed learning. And if you understand research, you can pick up a paper, you can read it, and you can decide whether it's worthwhile or not. If it's worthwhile, you can say, okay, I'm going to incorporate it into my practice, and I'm actually going to change the way that I practice. Today at lunch, I asked who was in charge of ADA reasonable accommodations, and I found out. Why is that important? I think if a student during pre-matriculation has the ability to apply for one, it gives us the time to get things in motion so they start with that accommodation in place. Why? It helps them to succeed. It helps them to get off to a really, really good start. I have been saying for a number of years now to students, what got you through is not going to, no, let me rephrase that. What got you here is not going to get you through. Because medical school is different than college. I think medical schools have failed students because they have not taught students how to learn, how to study, how to take tests in medical school. And it's complicated because it's an evolutionary process. What works in the first semester is not going to work in the second semester. What worked in the first year is not going to work in the second year. It's an evolutionary process that the students have to understand is a unique journey. And how do they find out what works and what doesn't? It's empirical. It's trial and fail. If it doesn't work, you have to make that determination quickly, early, and move on to something that may be working better and may be more effective. This is a book written by Frank J. Slabby, PhD. What is the title? How to Diagnose Like a Doctor on Your First Day in Medical School. This book describes the process, the cognitive process of learning to think like a physician. Along with the professional identity formation, I think what's equally as important, if not more important, is learning to think like a physician. Because what do the COMLEX exams test? All of them test one thing, the student's ability to think like a physician. So why not start during pre-matriculation? The next book is actually online. I mentioned Dr. Pelley before. He has a website. It's all about student success. He has a whole program laid out online. And guess what? It's free and publicly available. Why don't medical students take advantage of that and learn his approach to learning and multiple choice questions and help the sensing type become more like the intuitive type? Here's another book that's, I think, absolute must-reading. The lead author is Don Sefcik. Dr. Sefcik currently is the dean of the College of Osteopathic Medicine at Marian University. This is, in addition, how do you study? How do you take a standardized test? How many students know how to approach a standardized test? Very few. And when it comes to things like the COMLEX questions, what do? You read the lead-in first. Why? Because it's asking a question. The most likely diagnosis is. So if you read that lead-in first and you go through a very long clinical scenario, you are much more effective, much more focused, and much more able to discern the clinically relevant from the clinically irrelevant and answer the questions correctly. And you have to be aware of your time discipline. You should be going through that clinical scenario in about 40 seconds, spending 10 seconds on the answers. How many students know that? Curriculum and innovation. No, it's not an oxymoron. There are a number of models worth mentioning. I already mentioned that Hopkins was the basis for the Flexner report, the 2+2 model of 2 years of didactic followed with 2 years of the clinical or experiential learning. Hopkins has a different curriculum. They have moved beyond the model that Flexner used. They now have a curriculum called From Genes to Society. Kaiser Permanente is more than a health plan in California. Do you know they're opening their own medical school in Pasadena, California? They're going to matriculate a class of 48 students. And they are incorporating population health, all the things that they do as an integrated health delivery system into their curriculum. They're going to teach those students how to function in the Kaiser system. Ohio University Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine is at the Cleveland campus taking that blueprint of that Blue Ribbon Commission and implementing it as their curriculum. They are the only school in the country I know, specifically a College of Osteopathic Medicine, that is doing that. And then there's the Mayo Medical School. They have main campus in Rochester, Minnesota. They have another location in Arizona, and a third in Florida. The Arizona campus in particular is doing something very, very interesting. They are partnering with Arizona State University, where there is a College of the Science of Healthcare Delivery, which was opened in 2013. They have a master's degree in online, entirely online, the science of healthcare delivery. More than that, Mayo has taken 18 credit hours of that master's and incorporated it into the medical school curriculum. To me, the science of healthcare delivery is the future. It's key to the education of health professions and is the key to delivery of healthcare in the 21st century. And you can see that on the periphery, it includes things like complexity, ethics, interprofessionalism, and innovation. At the heart of it is high-value care. If you're a health system, what are you going to see that as? Value-based purchasing. There are things there that relate to, I think, every one of the colleges here. There is leadership, population health, informatics, systems, healthcare management. There are existing programs, departments, colleges here that can contribute to that sort of model. In order to pass COMLEX, it is absolutely necessary to learn to think like a physician, an osteopathic physician. Why? What does COMLEX test? The ability to think like a physician. It's not about recalling and regurgitating facts. It's developing this kind of working body of clinical knowledge that you can use to solve problems and answer higher order questions. And gee, guess what? That's the same thing you need to know to practice. Students have this misperception that you need to know this set of information, these facts for boards, and these facts and information for local exams. But guess what? They're one and the same. You need to know all of that in order to practice. So, M1, M2 means the first and second year of medical school. What do you need? You need active learning. Passive learning simply will not be tolerated. What do students want? Current medical students want passive learning. They want to sit there. They want to be spoon-fed. I told a story a number of times today. When I was a medical student, the chief of anesthesia came in, and the lights were low in the auditorium, and he started laughing. He goes, you know, medical school treats you like mushrooms. And everyone's looking at him quizzically. And he said, yeah, we keep you in the dark and feed you manure. That's the essence of passive learning. Clinical presentation relates to that slide about how COMLEX is changing. You need to know what to do when someone presents. The University of Calgary in the mid-90s came up with this presentation model. and they came up with approximately 125 different ways a patient presents. The patient presents with a headache. The patient presents with abdominal pain. The patient presents with abnormal uterine bleeding. You need to know what to do when the patient presents that way. And that's one way of teaching the physiology, the pathology, the histology, the pharmacology, everything around that framework. That presentation is the infrastructure. Interprofessional education is huge in the future. In fact, right now, in the COCA standards, there is standard 6.4 that requires the College of Osteopathic Medicine to have in its curriculum interprofessional education. And remember what I said about the science of healthcare delivery? There are 6 domains. What I have listed there are the elements that Mayo right now is using in its medical school, lifted from Arizona State University. You can see they have health policy, economics, and technology, patient or person-centered care, leadership, team-based care, population health, and high-value health care. They have 18 hours of that in the curriculum. They get a certificate that shows they completed 18 hours of the science of healthcare delivery. In addition, if they so choose, they can take the online master's degree through Arizona State University, they get advanced standing, and have credit because they have already had the 18 hours. Remember what I said about the points of transition in undergraduate medical education? Pre-matriculation is the first. Introduction to clerkships is the second. That is the transition between the classroom and the clinic. At my current school, we are using a 4-week model. It's the first rotation of the 3rd year. A lot of schools would do 7 days, 10 days, at the most 2 weeks. We did 4 weeks. And it is designed to teach all of those skills, reinforce others, introduce others, to prepare them to go out and be in the clinic. Otherwise, if you take someone from the classroom and just drop them into a clinical environment, what are they going to do? They're going to be overwhelmed. They will have the deer in the headlights look. And one of the things that you can do to minimize the trauma of medical education and make it better, make it a more positive experience for those students, is have things like this introduction to clerkship. It will be amazing to see the difference. And you can take a student who didn't have it and a student who did, put them in the same scenario, and the student who has had the benefit of the I2C will emerge as being better prepared clinically and functioning at a higher level. One of the things I did at my school is work on these core clinical campuses, whereby a student will spend essentially the entire 3rd year in one hospital system. And what was significant about it was I negotiated 5-year affiliation agreements, long-term agreements. Most agreements involving medical schools and rotation sites are 1-year agreements. I would propose in the future, 5 is good, but 10 is better. I would be so aggressive as to pursue 10-year affiliation agreements. And if you're in this kind of campus model, it's conducive to a whole different variety of learning. There's something known as a longitudinal integrated curriculum, originated in Harvard. Instead of doing blocks of 4 weeks, 4 weeks of peds, 4 weeks of family medicine, 4 weeks of OB, they have integrated throughout that year a couple of days here in peds, and actually it's more along a week here and 2 weeks there, of different kinds of learning experiences. So you may be in the hospital in the morning, in the clinic in the afternoon. And the idea is to try to follow a cohort of patients. If you're following a patient who's one of your patients, and that patient needs to have an ultrasound of her gallbladder, You go and you watch that ultrasound, and you learn about the system, all the steps necessary. So that's one way of learning systems-based care. Blended learning, I think, is huge. What does it mean? It means having the didactic material presented online in conjunction with the experiential learning in a clinical site. It's powerful. You'll learn better. And guess what? It's another way of helping the students to learn to think like a physician. But from an accreditation point of view, what does it do? It helps to demonstrate you have comparability across disparate sites. GME success is important to the students and to the accreditors. I think doing all the things that I've described up to this point collectively will allow you to have a differentiated student. I want people to say, that's a Sam Houston student. And that means that student is better prepared and performing at a higher level because of all of these things that have been done collectively to get that student to that point. And what is it? It's branding. You are creating the Sam Houston brand that's recognizable as being a medical student who is ostensibly different. And I talked about the debt. What if you could reduce the undergraduate medical education from 4 years to 3? That is one less year of student debt. That's probably anywhere from 80 to 100,000 of student debt. That's significant. And you can do that. You can do that after a year and a half, get them out. It can be in a federally qualified health center. It can be in a hospital. And you can even do it in conjunction with interprofessional education. So you have a whole team going through that last year and a half together. And what's even more powerful is having an arrangement so that that student could go into a direct match at that site in a primary care residency. Having a residency, a guaranteed residency, is priceless. So think of the value of this approach. 1 year less debt and a guaranteed residency. That's powerful. And to make sure your students, my students, are successful, you have a boot camp. It's another one of those transitions. It's the transition from the UME to the GME. And there are different skills, knowledge, and attribute metrics that are already defined for each specialty. So that means you would have one for peds, for example. And all the students who matched into peds would do that. And what would be very, very valuable is to have that documented somewhere. That's why you see the bullet there, a transcript that reflects EPAs and milestones. That's another way of differentiating your students. It's another way of branding your students and another way of giving you the ability to market your students as being highly desirable. I love this quote from R. Buckminster Fuller, who was the inventor of what? Anybody know? Geodesic dome. Are you from the science and engineering technology? Which college are you from? Wonderful. That's even better. Even better. He said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I think what I described is a new model. Here is another new model. This is something that is on the Sam Houston website. When I looked at that, I had one thought initially. With all of the level of detail about financing this College of Orthopedic Medicine to make it literally financially independent, that meant to me there was a lot of concern internally about this school and what it means and how much money it's going to cost. But beyond that, the second thing, look what's there. It's orange. Of course it's orange. But it's a single school building. It's standing there. It's like an island. What did John Donne say? No man is an island? That school is not an island. I think that image is inaccurate. The College of Osteopathic Medicine is not out there on some island. I started brainstorming about the different involvement that you could have with, in between, and among the different colleges that comprise Sam Houston State University, including, of course, the College of Osteopathic Medicine. Pre-matriculation. If it's discovered during pre-matriculation that a student has reading difficulty, where should you send them? Should you send them out? Shouldn't they go to somebody inside the institution? Last week, I had a student in my office melting down because this student had dyslexia and was worried about passing the COMLEX exam, passing boards. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to participate in pre-matriculation with either some of the activities I described or some of the follow-up, some of the remediation. And there are foundational sciences here, like Chad, who can participate in M1, M2, in the design of the curriculum or the delivery of the content. And then there's IPE, which I think is huge. Dual degrees. The leaders in medicine will have to have a dual degree. It's not enough to have that DO degree. You need something else, an MPH, an MBA, something else. Standardized patients. I told Ron I was going to pick on him. Can you imagine someone who is taking a theater course, an 18-year-old who is required to play an 80-year-old man as a standardized patient? That's acting. But imagine more. Somebody who's taking the makeup and staging course who will put makeup on that student to make that student look like an 80-year-old man. Imagine somebody from Mass Comm watching the videotape of this interaction, looking at that student to see how he or she communicates and assessing their interpersonal and communication skill. There are roles for the other schools. And remember what I said about the science of healthcare delivery? Students can get a certificate, maybe even an online master's. Why not take all of those different elements that the Arizona State University put together and do it here? Why not get all the different colleges involved and do a master's, an online master's? Research, I already talked about it. That's why the students should have the IRB training already done during pre-matriculation so they can get involved from day one in medical school. Mentoring. I can see somebody like Dr. Mary Robbins mentoring a medical student. A medical student doesn't necessarily need to be mentored by a physician. There are lots of PhDs who do fine and excellent mentoring. And faculty development. Can you imagine some of the faculty development that could occur here for the faculty from the College of Osteopathic Medicine, whether it's from the School of Business, the College of Education? Can you imagine faculty learning adult education from the College of Education? I know some people think adult education and medical students comprise an oxymoron, but it's still adult education. There are myriad opportunities for the different colleges to interact with the College of Osteopathic Medicine. So it's not out there on an island. One of the first things I think that ought to be done for operationalizing the College of Osteopathic Medicine is coming up with the mission, the vision, and the values, which must be aligned not only with the university, but also with the stakeholders and partners. I am pursuing my executive MBA online. One of the assignments was create your leadership brand statement. So when I wrote this, do you know what I had in mind? Here. Today. That was my inspiration. So you can read it, but I'm going to point out what's in blue there. That's significant. Adaptively proactive, diplomatically value-driven, and innovatively results-oriented. That summarizes my leadership. A rising tide lifts all boats. A rising tide lifts all boats. Thank you. It's time for some Q&A. Q&A time.
Questions?
Use the microphone, please. I've been answering questions all day. I still have a few answers left.
While they're thinking up questions, why don't you tell us about the nurse that you met when you were an intern?
I don't have the easiest last name to pronounce. So when I was teaching Dr. Robbins how to pronounce my name, I said, let me tell you a little story. I said, when I was an intern covering house nights, there was this little Filipino nurse who had great difficulty pronouncing my name. And she called me about 3 o'clock in the morning to this floor that was famous, 2 South. And she said, is this Dr. Cash my check? And I said, only on paydays. So that's how she could remember how to pronounce my name. So I told that to Mary, and she will always remember it, and that's how she remembers to pronounce my name.
It's true. It's clever. Do you have a question? I cannot believe we have no questions from this group.
I can explain it. The audience is composed largely of all those people I've met with all day, and they've asked all their questions already, and I answered them to the best of my ability. I mean, it's kind of funny to be here in court. Oh, it obviously is an HR question. Oh.
Just for those of us that aren't familiar with you, I'm sure many in the room know you or know more about you than I do. Can you kind of fill us in on where you are now and what you've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years, career-wise?
Well, I went to a small liberal arts college, Pennsylvania. I applied to medical school. First time, didn't get in, so I went off to graduate school in I had a full ride for a PhD in physiology and biophysics. It was back in the days when graduate students were indentured servants, and when I realized it would take 9 years to get a PhD, and I didn't want to spend that much time, I took a master's and reapplied to medical school. I went to the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, did my internship there in Florida at Suncoast, came back to Philadelphia to do my 4-year OB/GYN residency, and because I went through medical school on a National Health Service Corps scholarship, I swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I joined the U.S. Public Health Service, and I went to the Indian Health Service in Gallup, New Mexico for 4 years. And while there, I developed bilateral carpal tunnel syndrome. My surgical career came to an abrupt end, and I had to make a decision. I was at the crossroads of my career. So I decided to get a master's of public health degree, do another residency, and I did that in occupational environmental medicine. Long story short, I thought I'd be in the U.S. Public Health Service for 4 years. I spent 23 years there, with notable stops along the way, like being on a White House commission, for almost 5 years at FDA as the medical officer in the Office of Women's Health during memorable events like the controversy around Plan B going over the counter. And my last duty station was the NIH. I was in the NICHD, and I spent 3.5 years there. My current dean recruited me. I retired. I was out of work for 1 day and started my next career the next day. And I have been at the Philadelphia College of Obstetric Medicine since 2010. I was initially brought on to take care of the residency and become the new chair of OB/GYN, but the residency closed, and I then moved on to become the Assistant Dean of Clinical Education. Now I'm the Associate Dean of Clinical Education. So that's everything since 1970. You're welcome. I thought you were going to ask me an HR question.
I have a question, Joe.
Chad.
Obviously, securing residency slots is critical.
Yes.
Can you describe that process? How do you go about securing those slots, and what strategies would you use to secure those slots for our students?
That is a question that came up a number of times today. And as the Dean of the College of Obstetric Medicine, what is under your purview? Undergraduate medical education. But you have partners and stakeholders out there, and you have to get them involved early and often. And I would go so far as to say you need to get some of those partners involved with things like admissions, especially if you want to create a pipeline. They want to have some say in who goes to that medical school, so they have some control over who comes out the other end of the pipeline into their residency. It is a very complex situation that is not a one-size-fits-all. It takes multiple strategies. It takes many, many people working together to make it happen. And it requires things like adaptability, because with these hospital systems, there are mergers and acquisitions, and things can change abruptly overnight. That's why it's important to have things like those long-term affiliation agreements, so you have those long-term kind of relationships, which require a lot of nurturing, a lot of maintenance, and sometimes even hand-holding to make it work. But you do whatever it takes to make it work. So there's not a simple, easy answer to it, but it's really an ongoing process that never ends. And it has to always be evolving, always adapting to what's changing in the environment. Remember the one slide that said that we were in times of drastic change. We are in times of drastic change because healthcare is changing, the delivery is changing, the reimbursement's changing, and therefore the medical education must change as well. Do you have an HR question yet? There's a question up there.
Can you tell us why, Sam Houston? What interests you about being here?
There is something known as a founding dean. It's vastly different to go to a place that may be a medical school that's 100 years old and have people who are set, if not entrenched in their ways, who are not comfortable with change, and who probably exhibit something called intransigence. And everybody brings so much baggage, they all have a complete set of luggage. On the other hand, there is the opportunity to be the founding dean and have a blank canvas. Remember what Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. The best way I know to create the future is as the founding dean. Here's a question from the School of Business.
You talk about in your presentation creating a new reality, making a 4-year program a 3-year program, and that can transcend medical education. What would be the foreseeable ripple effects of that with accreditation, with GMEs, and have you thought about any unintended consequences of making that new reality?
That's a good question, because it wouldn't be for everybody. It would be a track, and it would be a track that is applicable to certain people. People who, for example, have already had some clinical experience and were better able to go through that accelerated kind of medical education. And it's also for somebody who wants to do primary care and practice in a specific location. If you want to do ophthalmology or neurosurgery, it's not for you. So because it would entail a portion of the class, not the entire class, it would be easier to sell it to the accreditors. And one of the problems I would foresee is a demand for that exceeded the supply. If you have a capacity to do it with 5 students and 20 students want to do it, what do you do? That's an unintended consequence. Then you're going to have some sort of selection process. And then to make sure there's a guaranteed direct match is a huge, huge undertaking. How can you guarantee that? Because it really is a leap of faith. Because you're taking somebody who hasn't really interviewed there and hasn't gone through comparison with others. But think about it. You don't have to interview them. Why? Because they've had a 1.5-year extended interview. You've seen them every day. You've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I tell students who are contemplating, for example, a core clinical campus, you're going to be there for 1 year, in some cases 2. Compare that with the traditional rotation of 4 weeks. During 4 weeks, you're going to be on your best behavior. But if you're there for 1 year or 2, they're going to see your warts. They're going to see you at your best and at your worst. So the same thing could be said for being in one of these situations for 1.5 years. They're going to really, really see you. And I think that they would want to have some sort of mechanism if someone were really, really bad. I'm talking about egregious. They say, wait a minute, all bets are off with her. All bets are off with him. I think you'd have to build in that kind of escape clause for them in order for it to work. If you don't, then there's another unintended consequence. You have a bad resident, a bad relationship, and all it takes is one of those to damage the relationship.
Thank you. No other questions? Then please, oh, sorry.
Joe, you were talking about how you accommodate different types of students coming through here. But at the same time, you also talked earlier today about the number of people applying for medical school. When you have such a large pool to select from, what characteristics do you want?
That's a loaded question.
It certainly is.
And profound, too. You're looking for someone who has the right balance, who has the knowledge, the ability to learn, and has the emotional intelligence to be effective. I hate to say it, but you don't have to be really that smart to be a physician, but you have to care. You have to have the empathy, and you have to be able to communicate. So it's looking for that ideal candidate. It's probably easier to pick a starting quarterback than it is a good medical student.
At least they can pass.
Well said. Yes?
us.
So I'd like to ask a question about your background as assistant dean and now associate dean. What active role have you played in the development of opportunities for students to intern and to do that?
Well, as assistant and associate dean, I'm in charge of the third and fourth year medical students. I'm responsible for half of their medical education, and that entails a lot of things. But you're specifically asking about building relationships and building opportunities for students to go on into a residency. That is a matter of establishing trust, inspiring confidence in you so they will do things for you. For example, when a student didn't match, I called it dialing for dollars. I was calling program directors all night long on the cell phone saying, do I have a student for you? That's the kind of thing that makes a difference. If you have a personal relationship with somebody, to pick up the phone and sell a student. I remember one student who, for whatever reason, didn't get an internship. And that student was going to go into the military, but because he didn't match, they deferred him for 1 year. So I said to the program director, this kid is great. I've known him since he was a first-year student. He's going to be an Army doctor. Can you help me here? And of course, the person said yes. But in developing things like that core clinical campus, there are some places that are interested in pure education. Then there are others that were interested in having a pipeline. They wanted to see you for your third year so they could make a determination. Do we want him in our residency or do we want her in our residency? So all of those things are always in the back of my mind. And whenever you're interacting with one of the partners, one of the affiliates, you're always working on about 5 different levels. You always have an agenda. There's always a hidden mission. And it's always to benefit the student.
No other questions? Well, then I invite you to continue the conversation with Dr. Joe, stepping down the hall here to the CJ Cafe where we will have some adult beverages and some snacks.
It's a wrap.